Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. We're continuing our series on idolatry, and I'm going to read from Colossians chapter 3. And it's the first 10 verses. Since you've been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits at the place of honour at God's right hand. Think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth. For you died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, is revealed to the whole world, you will share in all his glory. So put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you. Have nothing to do with sexual immorality, impurity, lust, and evil desires. Don't be greedy, for a greedy person is an idolater, worshipping the things of this world. Because of these sins, the anger of God is coming. You used to do these things when your life was still part of this world. But now is the time to get rid of anger, rage, malicious behaviour, slander, and dirty language. Don't lie to each other, for you have stripped off your old sinful nature and all its wicked deeds. Put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator and become like Him. Well, over the past few weeks, we've been thinking about the ways in which the old gods of the ancient world are still widely worshipped today. And as we've considered these issues, I hope that we've become aware of how much at risk we are from participating in these idolatries, even on a subconscious level. Simply attending church services on its own is no protection against the pervasive ethos and worldview of our surrounding culture, a worldview that shapes us in deep and powerful ways and far more than we realise. The truth is that these idolatries are so embedded in our cultural consciousness that we don't even recognise them as idolatry, and that makes them even more dangerous. The most discussed problem in the Bible is the problem of idolatry, and so Scripture repeatedly calls the people of God to discern these idols as false gods and to recognise, as Scripture affirms, that Yahweh alone is God. Scripture calls us to turn away from these false gods, these idols, and turn to the true and living God. The Apostle Paul commends the Thessalonian Christians for doing exactly that. One of the mistakes the people of Israel repeatedly made was to think that they could worship Yahweh alongside worshipping the gods of the surrounding nations. But the Bible's teaching on idolatry makes it clear that we have a binary choice. We can worship and serve idols, or we can worship and serve the true God, but we cannot do both. So today I'd like to explore an issue that on the face of it seems like an odd thing to include in an exploration of idolatry, if it were not for the fact that the Apostle Paul explicitly calls it idolatry in our text today. However, somewhat unhelpfully, he offers no explanation of what he means by calling greed idolatry. However, such an explicit declaration that greed is idolatry demands our attention, and therefore we must try to work out what he meant. The verb that is translated here as greed is pleonexion, and it's a compound word, meaning that it's made up from other words, and despite the impression that you might get from Bible commentaries, there are only two occurrences of the word in the New Testament. As we shall see, these occurrences are very different from one another, but both are crucial to understanding what Paul meant. The word has a very wide semantic range, and most translators translate it as either greed with a view to material possessions, or as covetousness with reference to sexual immorality. Whilst both meanings are correct, the word means more than both these concepts, either individually or together. When we put all the various aspects of the verb together, we get a word that means to have or to possess more, specifically more than someone else. It also refers to having a consuming ambition that might lead you to taking advantage of someone else. Consequently, from a biblical perspective, it also carries the idea of wanting more and more and more. And the root cause of that desire for more is a dissatisfaction with what God has provided. When we think that what we have is not enough, especially if someone else has more than us, we can become envious. And so we begin to covet what they have. Our lack of contentment in turn leads to a greedy grasping for more. And all of this is based on a lack of confidence that God is really God, or that he is a good God. Because in our estimation, his provision has fallen short of what we want. Whilst God has promised to provide all that we need, it is our nature to want more than we need. The point is that God has ambition for us, for our flourishing, but in our dissatisfaction with God's ambitions for our lives, we develop ambitions that are outside of God's purposes and will for us, and so we pursue them outside of his will and provision. So pleonexin is a small word with a big meaning, but all of that meaning is somehow encapsulated in our even smaller English word, greed. In Jewish thinking, greed and idolatry were often combined because whatever is the object of greed has replaced God as the centre of one's life. It's also worth noting, I think, that it's very unlikely that anyone would think of themselves as being greedy. If we have more than we need, we tend to rationalise it by telling ourselves that we deserve such abundance because we've worked hard for it, or because even God is blessing us. One biblical scholar writing about this passage noted the comment of a Roman Catholic priest who said that during his long years of service, all kinds of sins and crimes were confessed to him in the confessional, but never the sin of greed. It is in our sinful nature to think that all our desires are perfectly reasonable. We should also note that greed is not merely a personal sin, but is a social one. Not only insofar as an entire society may be greedy, selfishly grasping for gain, but also that individual greed always has a wider social impact. In the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, one of the main characters, Gordon Gekko, argues that greed is a vital force for progress. He claims that greed drives success and states that greed for life, money, love and knowledge has propelled humanity forward. Naturally, he uses the concept to justify his corporate takeover strategies, arguing that he is liberating companies from inefficiency. On the other hand, Karl Marx, the father of communism, believed that greed was not so much an issue of personal morality, but more of a social ill. He understood the gain of the greedy is always at the expense of someone else. Although many Christians might not like to admit it, the fact is that Marx viewed greed in a very biblical way. He understood that it demanded people's worship, effectively enslaving them, and that it therefore inevitably harmed other people. Idolatry is too complex an issue to be reduced to a single, simple definition, and coupled with the concept of greed as a linking, connecting force, we can see the way that the complexity and wide-ranging nature of idolatry works. For there is a sense in which the idolatry of greed underpins all the other idolatries that we've considered in this series, and causes them to overlap one another, so that there is almost always more than one idolatry in play in our lives at any given moment. And so we can think of greed then as that link that connects different idolatries together. In our materialistic and consumer-driven culture, it's very easy to see how greed and mammon are intertwined. In fact, advertising depends on it, for it is designed to stir up within us that selfish desire to have more stuff. And of course, to get more stuff, we must worship at Mammon's altar. When John Rockefeller became America's first billionaire in the early 20th century, he was asked how much money would be enough, and he is said to have replied, "Just 1 more million." However much we have, it's never quite enough. The same is true of sex, for the greedy desire for more and better sex drives many people into the arms of Aphrodite via pornography or multiple sexual partners in a hunger for more and more sexual experiences. I recently saw a list of the most visited websites, and one pornography website gets 6.5 billion visitors every month. What is true of Aphrodite is also true of Bacchus and the pursuit of pleasure. We want more and more of everything. It's also true even of the idolatry of violence. Atheists often blame religion for the war and violence in the world today, and actually they're correct in that. It is religion that causes war. It's just that they're pinning it on the wrong religion. War is caused by the idolatries of greed and money and power and violence, coming together in an unholy union. All idolatries overlap and serve one another, and greed is often the connecting force behind that overlapping. And the more we engage in one form of idolatry, the more we will inevitably slide into participation in more and more idolatries. So how do we resist that slide? That's the question, isn't it? Well, the most obvious answer is that the only way to turn away from idolatry is to turn to the living God. And although that's theologically correct, on its own it kind of doesn't really help us very much. Fortunately, there are some actual practices and habits that we can engage in that help us in that turning from idolatry to turning to God. Specifically, there are two ancient Christian practices that help us resist greed. In fact, they are possibly the only means of combating the idolatry of greed. And to explore them, we need to look at Paul's other use of pleonexion. It's found in 2 Corinthians 9 verse 5. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to visit you in advance and finish the arrangement for the generous gift you have promised. Then it will be ready as a generous gift, not as one grudgingly given. Paul's usage of pleonexion here is the very opposite of its use in Colossians 3 verse 5. It occurs in that final phrase, not as one grudgingly given. The Greek text literally says, not pleonexion. So here is Paul encouraging the Corinthians to make good on their promise to give a financial gift to the Judean churches. And what he basically says that he wants them to give the gift, certainly not as a result of coercion, but offered free and open-handed with no covetous desire. Furthermore, the not is the strongest option in the language that Paul could use. It's the same word he uses in Romans 6 verse 2 when, in regard to continuing to sin so that God's grace may increase, he says, certainly not pleonexion. In other words, the way to resist the idolatry of greed is to practice the interconnected virtues of generosity and hospitality. But what the ancient Christians understood by these virtues is quite different from what we think today. When most of us practice hospitality, we typically welcome those with whom we already have some established bonds and significant common ground. Hospitality builds and reinforces relationships among family, friends, and acquaintances. If you're invited to someone's home for dinner, it's not uncommon to say as you're leaving, well, it's our turn next time. And so a date is arranged and everyone's happy. But actually that's not hospitality, and in fact it effectively rejects the grace of the initial invitation. The key point of not pleonexion and of Christian hospitality is that it is generously offered to those who have no means of doing something in return. It is done with no desire or means of gain for the one being hospitable. For the first Christians, a key text on this issue was Jesus' command in Luke 14. When you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. In other words, show generous hospitality to those on the margins of society, the people who have no means of paying you back. Furthermore, generous hospitality without gain, as practiced by the first Christians, was in stark contrast to the hospitality of the Greco-Roman world, where it was only practiced as a means of assisting a person's social advancement. Generous hospitality was also a significant factor in church growth, and so we can say that generosity and hospitality are missional imperatives. Not only are they an expression of faith, but they also embody and anticipate God's welcome of us and of the stranger. Hospitality, then, is nothing other than our learning to receive through the Spirit and the Son the generous overflow of God's own bountiful gifts. Whereas today most of us would probably think of hospitality as a nice extra if we have the time and resources, we rarely view it as a spiritual obligation or as a dynamic expression of vibrant Christianity. The call for Christians to practice generosity and hospitality without reciprocity is almost always a part of the ethical teaching about the behaviour expected of disciples within the New Testament. For example, 2 Corinthians 9 and 11, you will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion, and through us your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. 1 Timothy 6 verse 17 to 19, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant or to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Romans 12 and 13, share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. We should note regarding this text that although the sharing is with other believers, it's also to those who are in need and who presumably therefore cannot repay the generosity. 1 Peter 4 verses 9 to 10, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. I could go on citing scripture verses, but you get the point, I'm sure. The only way to really combat the idolatry of greed is to be generously hospitable, for it prevents greed from gaining a hold on us. In generous hospitality, we recognise that everything we have is a gift from God, and it's to be used in His service in a way that results in thanksgiving for Him and not for our gain. Generosity and hospitality are in fact a measure of how much we have turned from idols and turned to the living God. For as the old Danish proverb states, if there is room in the heart, there is room in the house. The problem, of course, is that we love our idolatries, and the idolatry of greed is difficult for us to give up. Even if we find it easy to be generous and hospitable to family or friends, we are less willing to be generous and hospitable for strangers or for those from whom we have nothing to gain. We might say it's a nice idea. I know I should probably do it, but I can't. It's just not my gift. The thing is, it's not a gift. It's a command. So let me leave you today with a text from the Apostle James in chapter 4 verse 17. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it's a sin for them. Thanks for listening today, and if you find these signposts helpful, please click on the subscribe button below.